Whispers in the dark.
They wear a badge, but even they get scared. These are the real horror stories police don't talk about. Like and subscribe if you can make it to the end. I'm a rookie cop currently working the night shift. I'm just a normal patrol officer conducting traffic stops and responding to basic 911 calls. 2 nights in a row last week, I was called to the same house. Dispatch had called me to check out the house as someone had dialed 911 and hung up. The house was a couple miles from me in my patrol zone. I arrived to the house quickly and turned up the dirt driveway through the trees onto the property. The house was dark. No lights on, no cars, nothing. I parked my squad car in the far right side of the property and went to the front door, taking note that all the windows were properly shut. I knocked on the door and no answer. The door was also locked. For my immediate guess, the place was abandoned for years by the looks of it. I called to dispatch that the place was abandoned and nobody was there, then I left. The next night, I was working the same shift and around a similar time, I got a call from dispatch that there was another 911 call from the same house. Only this time, someone could be heard crying on the other end before the call ended. I was asked to check out the house again. This time I was a little further away, but still the drive wasn't too bad. I pulled out the dirt driveway again onto the property, and again, no lights, no cars. I approached the front door again, and this time it was left cracked open. I knocked on the door while holding the doorknob to prevent the door from pushing open. No answer. I called the dispatch that I would be entering the house, which I was cleared to do since the crying over the line implied an urgent situation inside the house. I drew my gun and entered the house. I tried to find a light switch without luck. I had my gun in one hand and now my flashlight in the other. The house was mostly silent besides the sound coming from behind a closed door. It was the basement door. I called the dispatch for backup and whisper. The sound coming from down in that basement was a tone, like a dial tone of a phone. I started walking down the stairs as quietly as possible. I got to the bottom and followed the noise of the dial tone to an old early 2000s style landline speakerphone. The phone was off the hook and it was playing the dial tone on speakerphone. I put the phone on the hook to silence the noise, and it was almost as if it were planned to happen like this. As soon as the phone hit the hook, I heard a muzzled laughing type noise in a far corner of the basement. I turned around and there was some guy standing opposite me in the basement with his hand over his mouth, and he appeared to be laughing. But it wasn't this genuine laugh. It was more like a sickly, mentally unstable laugh. The guy was holding something in his other hand. I couldn't see what it was at first, but when he raised his hand up to his head, I realized he was holding a revolver. I aimed my gun at him and yelled to drop the weapon. He paused as he had his revolver to his head, apparently about to pull the trigger. So I shot him in the arm twice, causing him to drop the gun. He screamed in pain as I cuffed him and brought him upstairs. I requested a medical team at once. A second squad car pulled up, as did an ambulance a few minutes later. The scariest part about this for me was not that I had to shoot a man in the arm twice, but that I was mere seconds away from seeing a man spray his brains out onto the wall. I was a state trooper for 25 years, and through the years I experienced it all. Or at least that's what I thought at the time. This happened quite a few years back. I was on night patrol on an interstate at about 4:30 a.m. Now, I don't know if you guys know what the show Cops is, but basically, it's where cameramen would follow around real cops, filming everything that goes down. The episodes would consist of a compilation of the most interesting clips. The show is insanely popular, but unfortunately nowadays, new episodes are no longer made. Back then, however, I was lucky enough to actually be featured on the show. Even though I didn't show up in many episodes, I still thought it was really cool. This night was one of the nights I had a cameraman following me around for the show. I remember his name was Joe and was honestly a pretty down-to-earth guy. Anyway, I would usually have my car parked near a bush to hide myself from the view of oncoming speeding cars. But at this hour, I didn't really ever try to hide too much. I remember we were just driving down the interstate. I didn't work in the best area. There were a decent amount of abandoned buildings visible from the road, and because of this, I adopted into my nightly routine to enter the parking lots of them as they were hot spots for drug activity. One in particular was an abandoned gas station building. The exit for it was coming up, so I figured I might as well check it out. Joe started filming, and as we pulled up, we could both clearly see a flashlight moving around in the building. I pulled into the parking lot and put the car in park. At this point, I was almost positive some sort of drug deal was going on inside, as I could still see the flashlight moving around. But a part of me hesitated as there were no other cars in the parking lot. I also realized if there was a drug deal going on, there would have been at least 2 flashlights visible from the outside of the building. I figured either way, I'd have to investigate. I went over to the cruiser's speaker, yelling out police and explaining how whoever was inside needed to exit the building immediately. Oh, right as I did this, the flashlight from inside turned off. It was now eerily silent. I decided I'd have no choice but to enter the building and to get whoever was inside to leave. So I did. I got out of the cruiser and proceeded to walk towards the wide-open front door with Joe and his camera not far behind me. As I approached, I couldn't help but notice a terrible smell. It was as if an animal died in there and had been in there for at least a week. I peeked inside with my flashlight, once again yelling out police. Now, this gas station was small, so any sound could pretty much be heard from anywhere in the building. I stayed quiet for a second, just listening. That's when I swear I could hear what sounded like something being dragged across the floor from the other side of the building. Who's there? I got no response. I walked inside the building, and in one of the back rooms, I could see what looked like a figure. I shined my flashlight in the figure's direction, but right as I did, whoever it was bolted and eventually left through a back exit. I started chasing after the guy, but as soon as I exited the same back exit, I didn't see anything. Almost the whole area was surrounded by a cornfield, so there was no way I was going to find this guy. But I figured I had to try. I ran out in some random direction, but stopped only after a few seconds, realizing it was pointless. Defeated and still confused as to why the guy ran, Joe and I went back to the gas station. But what we found left behind made it perfectly clear. There in the back room, we found the lifeless remains of a dead body. I immediately called for backup, explaining the situation. Unfortunately, the guy responsible was never found, and the body itself couldn't be identified. For obvious reasons, what we caught on video that night was never used in the final show. You're still here? That means you're into this. Do us a favor, drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Now, back to the next chilling story. When I was 17, my mom had a job that required her to be out of town a lot. And because of this, my dad would often take me out to eat for a good part of my teen years. I remember one night we both decided to go to Pizza Hut for dinner. It was around 7 p.m. and my dad had just finished up his shift at work. Back then, my dad worked as a police officer, and at least at the time would work pretty normal hours. Anyways, we went to Pizza Hut and got our usual. On our way back home, I remember we were pretty deep into a conversation, though I don't remember what it was about. After a while, I noticed my dad wasn't really responding anymore. We were fairly close to our house, but still on main roads before we needed to turn into our neighborhood. At first, I thought he just lost interest, but I glanced across and noticed he was permanently looking in the rearview mirror. I asked him what was up, and he mentioned how the car behind us had been following us ever since we left the Pizza Hut parking lot. I remember glancing behind us, and sure enough, some blacked-out SUV was tailgating. My dad mentioned how he needed to verify if this car was actually following us. He proceeded to pull into the next street and do a few turns just to get back onto the main road. I will never forget that feeling, that sinking feeling as I watched the car sharply turn back behind ours. Now, it was around 9 p.m. on a weekday, so there weren't that many cars on the road. The car behind us then put its high beams on, and at that point, my dad was completely focused. He had fully shut me out, putting all his attention into losing whoever was following us. A few minutes of this went by when he told me to grab his phone from his pocket, call someone in his contacts, and put it on speaker. My hands were shaking at this point. I could barely press the buttons. I remember a cheerful voice answered, but before the guy could say anything else, my dad quickly summarized the situation. There was a pause, and I could hear voices speaking in the background along with radio beeping sounds. My dad was yelling at me to keep naming the streets we were on to the guy on the phone, as at that point my dad was still randomly turning down different streets, trying to lose the car behind us. Okay, turn it to Tesco Car Park. It's coming up on your left. We've got 3 response vehicles coming in from the other direction. My dad responded, and as we swung into the near empty car park with the car behind, a still enclosed pursuit, blue and red lights quickly surrounded us in what felt like all directions. The sound of sirens was deafening. My dad bolted out of the car and ran in some direction. After a few minutes of shouting, the driver's side door swung open. My dad got in and calmly started driving away. As we turned around in the car park back towards the entrance, I could see the police surrounding the vehicle that had been following us, and 3 men in what looked like to be their late 20s were handcuffed leaning over the car. On our way home, my dad told me everything. He explained that he was on a drugs team that dealt with the interception of large shipments of drugs that were being transferred across the country, something I hadn't known until that point. He continued by saying people would lose a lot of money when they were caught, and some didn't like that, which sometimes resulted in specific officers being targeted. My dad would quit his job as a police officer a few years later, though he admits this was by far his most disturbing experience, especially considering I was along to witness it. My partner and I got a breaking and entering call late one Friday night. I'd never responded to a call like that before, but it sounded serious. A young woman was home alone and heard footsteps downstairs, but when she was on the 911 call, the call was cut before she could give her location in the house. We arrived to the home and entered through the front door, which was left unlocked, which later proved to be how the break-in occurred. Both of us shouted police with our guns drawn, expecting the suspect to be armed. We called out for Anna, that was the homeowner's name. Anna never called back to us. We knew she must have been scared and didn't want to give away her position to the intruder. We checked the whole first floor, which was small and quick. There didn't appear to be a basement. A door shutting upstairs drew my partner and I's attention. I led the way upstairs. All the doors had been shut, so I couldn't really tell which door I had just heard. I told my partner to check that one while I checked this one. I turned the doorknob and kicked the door open, immediately lifting my gun into the air. It was a dark, empty room. I heard breathing in this room, though. It sounded like a woman's breathing. I looked at the closet door, which was slit slightly open, and I saw half a face, mostly someone's eye, peeking through the opening. Resting assured it was Anna, I lowered my gun and said, "Anna, it's okay. You can come out." But she didn't, and the breathing quieted. Then my partner in the next room over called Jason. I found her. My feeling in that room suddenly went from at ease to ready to throw up. I raised my gun again and yelled, "Come out of the closet." They did not obey, so I called my partner into the room. He turned on the light and we opened the closet together to see this disheveled, drugged-out woman holding one of Anna's kitchen knives. With 2 guns pointed at her, she dropped the knife and we brought her into the precinct. Thank God I was stationed in a safer area of town the next year, and I haven't gotten any breaking and entering calls since then. As a state trooper for 15 years, I've experienced my share of close calls and uncomfortable situations. This happened over a decade ago when I was still relatively new to the job. I was on night patrol on an interstate about 2:30 a.m. I usually had my car parked near a bush to hide myself from view from oncoming speeding cars, but at this hour, I didn't really try to hide too much. I was moving my car and pulled into a gas station that sat on the side of the interstate. It was closed not because it was late, but rather it was temporarily out of service. I noticed 2 cars parked in the lot next to each other. There was nothing immediately suspicious about this, but I kept my eye out just because strange things happen at this hour. I parked my car in a way that I could watch the interstate as well as these 2 parked cars. I realized that I didn't see anyone in either of those cars, though. Well, this was quite suspicious. The station was closed and there were no workers here. I exited my car with my hands on my belt and approached the 2 cars. I tapped on the windows for the both of them. Nobody in either of them, as I suspected. I began to walk around the lot as the occasional car zipped down the interstate. I went up to the glass of the closed gas station and knocked on it. I turned around, dumbfounded. Whose cars were these? Just as I imagined they could be in the woods somewhere, I heard someone running from around the building and asked for my help. He was some young 20-year-old man like me at the time. He said his car wouldn't start and needed help. Now, I told him right away that I was no mechanic and that he'd need to call a towing company, but he practically begged me to just check under the hood for a second. He ran to his driver's side and popped the hood. I looked under the hood with him, not really knowing what to look for because I wasn't much of a car guy at the time. I asked if his battery died, and when I looked at him, I took note that he was looking around very oddly. He replied, "I don't think so." I then looked at the car parked next to him. "Whose car is that?" I asked him. He said he didn't know. He simply parked there to see if there was a porta potty in the back or something. I was reading through this kid's bullshit. Something was up here. As I looked back at the guy from the two cars, I saw him looking back at something or someone. I turned and saw another guy approaching me with a knife in his hand. I unholstered my gun and aimed it at him. He dropped the knife and put his hands up. They both did. I immediately called for backup while keeping the two at gunpoint. I cuffed the one who was holding the knife and placed him in the back of my car, and then grabbed the second pair from my glove box and cuffed the second guy. When backup arrived, I went to the back of the gas station where the first guy had originally approached me from. What I found there still holds up to be the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen in all of my years as a trooper. There were two fresh dead bodies wrapped in garbage bags, cut up in 2 pieces each to fit in the bags. Along with them was also a shovel sitting on the concrete by the woods. The two were planning on burying the bodies somewhere in the woods off the interstate, and it seemed they were in a hurry. These two were a couple of the dumbest people I had ever interacted with, being that out of anywhere in the state, they chose to bury 2 bodies off an interstate behind a gas station. Going to sleep at night knowing you almost had your throat slit by somebody on the job messes with you, and I didn't get much sleep for a while. My partner and I got a radio call of a welfare check, which is just a check on the welfare of a person. A woman's ex-boyfriend called because he received texts from his ex stating that she wished it had never ended and that she could no longer go on without him. We get to the place, knock, pound, etc., no answer. We call the number the ex provided and get an answer and a hang-up. So we hear it from the outside window and know she's in there. We say we're going to break the door down if she doesn't answer. We hear some slurred mess of speech. Door unlocks but doesn't open. We open the door to find a young woman, wet, naked, pale as hell, and swaying in one spot, her hands bleeding. We call a rescue ambulance and she's off to the hospital. Now to the creepy part. None of the lights would turn on, so we conduct a safety search and find candles lit in the bedroom and bathroom. On the walls were Bible scriptures written in her blood in a tub of brown water, the water being mixed with old blood. I don't know how she survived because that water was dark. She had been sitting in it for approximately 3 to 4 hours. Before getting transferred to a different county, I used to work as a police officer in Burlington, New Jersey. Burlington is not a safe place. They say that crime there is 88% higher than the rest of Jersey. Having worked there for a year, I got to learn that firsthand. Now, there would be a lot of break-ins, robberies, assaults, and after a while, you'd get used to those calls. Sometimes, you'd get pretty strange, unsettling calls, though. This was one of them. Most Burlington locals are familiar with the McNeil Mansion, a long-abandoned mansion that sits right on the Delaware River. The home was constructed in 1894 to serve as a residence for Andrew H. McNeil, as well as his wife and 4 daughters. The house had been abandoned and left in a case since 1974 and is now owned by the county. Sometimes there would be kids trespassing on the property to check it out. Sometime past midnight, I was told over the radio by dispatch to investigate the property as there was a report by a neighboring house that there were some people seen hopping the fence to the property. Upon entering the property, I noticed a light coming from inside one of the upstairs windows. Part of me inside died a little as I realized someone was in there and that it was my job to go in and get them out. I requested backup into my radio and stated I would be entering the mansion to pursue a trespasser. I scanned the outside of the house once more looking for an entry point and found one of the lower windows was smashed open and easily accessible. And that's how I made my way in. Right away, first thing I did was make my presence as a police officer known. I was inside what appeared to once be the living room of the mansion, rubble covering the whole floor. I heard footsteps upstairs and I shouted again, expecting them to come down the stairs. When they didn't, then it was my job to come up. I went up the stairway and started walking around. There was no way to hide my steps with all the litter and rubble on the ground. I heard something fall in a nearby room. This is when the worry and fear really started to kick in. At this point, I had my hand on my gun holster, ready to react. Though let me tell you, having a gun doesn't make you feel invincible. I shouted again to try and draw out the trespassers from the room. You ever hear that dumb, overused quote, "I didn't sign up for this in the movies"? Well, I was pretty much feeling that exact way. I stepped into the room that I thought was where the noise had echoed from. It was some small, weird room with a bunch of windows with blurred glass film. There was a sliding closet door open about 3/4, so they had to be in there. I took out my pepper spray and gave one more warning that I was a police officer before yanking the closet open fully. It was empty. This made no sense. I looked around the room and the windows. They looked to an outside deck, and there was someone standing behind one of them. I couldn't see anything about their features other than the outline of their body, but then I realized there were people at the other windows too. The way they were all looking at me through the window film, such a ghostly appearance they gave, like a picture from a kid's horror novel. I found the door to that deck in an adjacent room. When I stepped out, the 3 figures standing at the windows were gone. I didn't see any other way off the deck besides the door I came out through. I saw the flashing lights of a police car through a bunch of trees parked on the same lot as me. Another officer announced his and his partner's arrival to me over the radio. I met the officers outside the house and pointed up at the deck where I saw 3 people standing. The 8 were creeped out as well when I described how they all just stood there at their own windows looking in. We searched the whole mansion together. I eventually came to a small room with a window on the first floor. And once again, something was outside this window. I had to step closer to figure out if it was a person's head or not. When they got too close, the object lowered below the window. I radioed the other officers to go outside with me. We looked around the whole property and didn't find anyone. We searched for another 10-15 minutes before closing up all the entrances to the house and moving on. The scariest part of this for me was definitely seeing 3 ghost-like silhouettes, all standing at their own of the 3 windows to that deck, looking inside at me. Police officers have always gotten a bad rap for their authority over us, which is very often abused. However, the police are the first ones to get called into action whenever trouble arises, and they'll no doubt see some disturbing stuff. Here are 4 haunting stories of former police officers. Number 4. I was a cop for 30 years. I retired at the age of 50, so of course I had some weird calls. But I'll never forget the night that me and my partner Steve were called to respond to a domestic abuse report. The call was made by a neighbor. These calls were never really a big deal. It usually gave us something to do during the night. Not that I enjoy dealing with couples fighting and all that stuff. So we arrived at the house. I still vividly remember the address, and I remember the door was left wide open. The second we stepped inside, the strong scent of marijuana filled our lungs. It was everywhere. Not just marijuana, though. There was a strong smell of chemicals, which we assumed was either meth or cocaine. We made our presence known by asking for the couple to come out into sight. A thump from the upstairs gave away their position. Steve had his hand on his holster, ready to pull his gun, but me, I wasn't nervous yet. Steve told me to move quietly up the stairs. We normally listen to each other, so I humored his paranoia. There were 3 doors, 2 open and 1 closed. The closed door led in the direction where the thud in the ceiling was. I banged on the door before swinging it open myself. The smell was the first thing we noticed, then the body. The body was very obviously rotted. We knew even in the dark. We pulled our guns. Steve turned on the light. I told him to scan that room while I scanned the rest of the house. I was shaking all over now. I hated my job at that moment. I wanted to run back to the car and leave, for I was sure I could die at any moment. I found my hand to be stuck on the doorknob until I finally had the balls to turn it and push the door open with force. I turned the light on, but there was nobody inside. It was a disturbingly tiny room. No windows and no furniture, except for a dirty old cot. Steve suddenly screamed and I rushed across the hall to see what was going on. There was some shirtless guy laying flat above one of the dressers in the room. We had him at gunpoint, yelling at him to come down when something grabbed my ankle and tried to pull me to the floor. There was a hand coming from under the bed. I stomped on the arm with my other foot and pulled out a frail, trashy-looking woman who was obviously baked. I cuffed her and Steve cuffed the man. We were on our way outside with the 2 crazies screaming at us, but we had one final surprise coming. Some psycho from upstairs started screaming, charging at us down the stairs with a knife raised in the air. Steve reacted just fast enough to save my ass by 2 seconds, shooting the guy dead. This was a crack house. Somehow none of the neighbors could smell anything suspicious. The dead woman on the bed was killed by the man of the two we caught, who admitted to killing her due to lack of payment. The man was sentenced to life without parole. The woman was sentenced to 30 years. Steve says he never felt bad about what he did. He says he just rid the world of one more piece of trash. Number 3. Myself and a buddy on my squad responded to an alarm. The incident location was an old office-type building that had been converted to a doctor's office. There was a pharmacy attached to it as well. Our dispatch received a motion signal from an upstairs office. The key holder arrives on the scene and we go in to secure the building. The stairs were locked behind a door that, of course, the key holder didn't have a key to, so we took the elevator up to the second floor. The elevator opens to a pitch-black hallway, except for one overhead light at the end of the hall. We start checking the doors, and so far, all are secured. We get to the last office, and sure enough, the door is unlocked. We make entry and observe it to be an unused office. The door opened to a sizable waiting room and reception area. There were about 10 or 12 exam rooms, all cleared with no hiccups. We exit the office, and immediately something seems off. That's when I realized the overhead light at our end of the hallway that was on before had been turned off. It was replaced by another light over at the elevators. I look at my squad mate, and he's completely white. I ask him what's wrong, and he says, "Weren't all those doors we just checked closed and locked?" I tell him, "Yeah, so?" My buddy says, "Well, now they're all standing open." Sure enough, all the offices down the hallway we had just checked were now standing open. The pucker factor sinks in at this point, so we start clearing and securing offices. We finish the last office, and on our way out, just before we turn the corner to get into the waiting area, the main door just slams shut. Then our radios start going nuts with some kind of static feedback. Now I just want to get the hell out of there. We get back in the elevator and head down to the first floor in hopes to make contact with the key holder again. However, the key holder is nowhere to be found. I contact dispatch and request a callback number for the key holder so I can advise them of what we found. Dispatch states that the key holder was still en route to us and was advising an ETA of 5 minutes. I advised dispatch that we had already been out with the key holder. Dispatch requests I give them a call. I call dispatch and she tells me that there is no way we were out with the key holder. She states that the alarm company had only just made contact with one. Eventually, the real key holder arrives on the scene and I ask her about the man that had let us in the building. She asked me to describe him, so I did. She states that sounds like one of the doctors that used to lease the office on the second floor at the end of the hall. She then states that he had committed suicide at his summer home several days ago. Number 2, I was responding to a call in the village. A resident was reporting noises coming from one of the abandoned buildings from across the street, most likely trespassing. I arrived and began my search in the building. It used to be a 2-story convenience store, and now it was completely stripped empty except for the parts attached to the floor, like the counter and shelves. The lights didn't work in there either. I checked every small aisle for anyone to possibly be hiding in, and then I did the same thing upstairs. It was completely empty. On my way back into my car, I looked back at the building and saw somebody at the window on the second floor. It was a woman with long gray hair down past her shoulders. She was no doubt looking down at me with a wide smile on her face. I hurried back inside, making it upstairs in no more than 10 seconds, but the window was clear. There was nobody in sight. I checked all 3 aisles at least 10 times. I checked behind the counter. I checked the bathroom. It was clear. I was a little nervous, so I left again, thinking my mind was fooling me. I looked back at the window, and there she was again, the same mockingly disturbing smile on her face. I went back up there again, this time running around all 3 aisles trying to find this woman. I was about to give it up once more and leave for good when I noticed something in my peripheral vision. It was on the ceiling. A dark shade of black latched onto the ceiling. I shined my light up there, and there she was. That crazed woman looked at me, still with a horrifying smile on her face as she held onto 2 hook-like objects in the ceiling with her hands while her feet were pushed up against the tile to gain support. She laughed like a freak all the way down to the station. I don't know if she had some kind of mental disability or not. It seemed like she was just toying with me, but not at all in a good way. She stared me down through the mirror the whole ride. Number 1. In all my years of being a police officer in Floyd County, Georgia, I had only experienced 2 horrifying situations. I'll share with you the worst of the two. It was a slow night, and I was patrolling the dirt roads in my cruiser. At this particular spot, there were tiny woods on both sides of the road, and then it all started. I spotted somebody jumping into the woods on the left. I only saw half of them, though. They were gone so quickly. I pulled up closer and shined the spotlight into the woods. I didn't see them. Unfortunately, it was kind of my job to check on things like this, so I hesitantly stepped out from the car and began searching. In a moment like this, I was so ready to pull my gun as I was actually terrified. And then the cliched snap of a branch from behind a tree almost made me want to run back to the car, but I instead did my job and called for them to come out. Someone wearing a mask stepped out from the tree. I told them to raise their arms, take off their mask, and come to me slowly. They raised their hands, but they didn't remove the mask. I tried to demonstrate my authority by yelling this time, ordering them to take it off. They looked as if they were about to take it off, when suddenly, he or she looked to their left and then back at me. I heard footsteps coming from my right. I drew my gun. I yelled as loud as I could for everybody to come out with their hands up. You may be thinking, why? Well, if you were in this position, in this setting, you would have been shitting yourself just like I was. Another person wearing a mask walked over, this one holding an axe. I had my gun locked on him, but suddenly, footsteps started coming from all directions. I looked around and I was surrounded. There were at least 10 strangers wearing masks surrounding me almost in a circle with only an opening behind me. Half of them were armed with axes and the like. I stood there, gun raised, but not even aimed at anything at this point. I felt like I was going to throw up. One of them, I'm not sure which, finally broke the silence, telling me in a muffled, deep voice, "Go away." My heart dropped as he said this, in a way that I knew I was going to live. I turned and ran for the car, driving down the road half a mile, all while calling for backup. As you would guess, the whole group was gone from the woods when a search squad arrived. I have a theory on this, however. I believe that what I witnessed was some kind of fucked up secret society that was planning on trapping an innocent passerby, and I think that whoever jumped into the woods as I was passing recognized my car as a police car and tried to hide. Had I not been a police officer, I believe they would have stopped me, led me to the woods, and done whatever this group does for its sick kicks. I've been a deputy sheriff in rural Montana for just about 12 years, and you get used to the nights being pretty quiet. My shifts were usually uneventful, mostly speeding tickets and helping ranchers track down lost cattle. But every now and then, something unsettling would crop up, something that wouldn't leave my mind even when the sun rose. This particular night began around 1:45 a.m. Dispatch crackled to life on my radio, breaking the monotony of the empty county road I was patrolling. Unit 14, we have a call reporting suspicious activity at Whispering Pines Campground. Possible disturbance. Over. Unit 14 responding, I replied, switching on my lights but leaving the siren off. The campground was a good 20-minute drive from where I was, nestled deep in a wooded area popular with locals and weekend tourists alike. It had always been a quiet place. Maybe occasionally we'd break up some noisy campers drinking too late, but nothing ever serious. As I drove, the dispatcher filled me in. Apparently, another camper reported hearing screams and seeing people running into the woods. By the time the caller had dialed 911, things had gone silent again. My stomach tightened instinctively. This didn't sound like the usual drunken scuffle or prank. I turned onto the narrow, winding road that led to the campground. Tall, dense pines loomed overhead, blocking most of the moonlight. Everything beyond my headlights was enveloped in shadow, amplifying the feeling of isolation. I parked near the entrance and killed the engine, grabbing my flashlight and stepping out. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft whispering of the wind through the trees. "Sheriff's Department. Anyone out here?" My voice echoed slightly as I entered the main campground area. A half-dozen tents and a few RVs dotted the clearing, but everything looked eerily abandoned. Flashlights, coolers, camping chairs, all left behind as if people had simply vanished into thin air. I approached the nearest tent and called again, louder this time. "Hello? Sheriff's Department. If you're here, please come out." No answer. I cautiously unzipped the tent flap and shone my flashlight inside. Sleeping bags lay twisted and thrown aside, personal belongings scattered haphazardly. The scene looked frantic, panicked, like whoever had been inside fled in a hurry. That feeling of unease in my stomach grew deeper. Moving from tent to tent, the story was the same: scattered belongings, abandoned in chaos. Near one tent, I found something that made my blood run cold. A child's teddy bear, trampled in the dirt, its glassy eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. The sight stopped me cold. Kids were here, and now they were nowhere to be seen. I radioed dispatch, requesting immediate backup and search teams. "Something's really wrong here," I emphasized. "We might have multiple missing people." "Copy that, Unit 14, dispatch responded calmly. "Backup en route." Just as I clipped the radio back onto my belt, I heard something, a faint rustle from the tree line, like footsteps on dry leaves. I spun around, pointing my flashlight into the darkness. "Sheriff's Department. Who's there?" My voice was steady, but my heart was hammering. For several seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then, deeper in the trees, a soft, distant laugh, high-pitched, almost childish, floated through the air. It echoed, distorted by distance, sending a chill racing down my spine. Without thinking, I moved toward the sound, stepping into the forest. Twigs snapped beneath my boots, and I strained to hear any further noises. After about 30 yards, I paused, realizing the danger of wandering too far alone. As I turned to head back, another sound cut through the stillness, a scream, sharp and terrified, slicing through the night. It was unmistakably human and filled with pure, raw fear. This was no ordinary call. This was something else entirely. I broke into a run, heading deeper into the darkness, my flashlight beam jumping wildly ahead, illuminating fleeting glimpses of the trees as dread filled my gut. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted deeper into the woods, the scream still ringing in my ears. The beam of my flashlight darted frantically across the underbrush, catching glimpses of twisted branches and roots reaching out like skeletal hands. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees becoming denser, their branches blocking out even the faint moonlight. My radio crackled with static as dispatch tried to communicate, but their words were lost amidst the interference. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I called again, slowing my pace and straining to listen for any further sounds. But all I could hear was my own heavy breathing and the pounding of my heart. The eerie silence returned, even heavier than before. I took a few cautious steps forward, sweeping my flashlight from side to side. Then my foot caught on something, and I stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. I looked down and saw a torn piece of fabric snagged on a thorny bush. I pulled it free, shining my flashlight on it, a sleeve from a child's pajama top patterned with small stars. My stomach lurched. This was getting worse by the second. "Sheriff, over here." The sudden call startled me, and I swung my flashlight sharply to my right. Relief surged through me as I saw a man stumbling toward me through the trees. He looked disheveled, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Calm down, sir," I said, grabbing his shoulders as he nearly fell against me. "Tell me what happened. Where is everyone else?" "Gone," he gasped, looking wildly around. They took them. They took my wife, my daughter." "Who? Who took them?" My voice was firm, trying to steady him. "I don't know." I couldn't see them clearly. "Just shadows. They move so fast," he said, gripping my arm tightly. "We tried to run, but it was like they were everywhere." "Stay calm," I reassured him, guiding him back toward the campground clearing. "Backup is on the way. We'll find them." He shook his head, trembling violently. "You don't understand. They're not human." Before I could respond, another scream pierced the air, echoing closer this time. The man grabbed my arm tighter, his fingernails digging in painfully. "That's my wife," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, we have to help her." I nodded, pushing my own rising fear down. "All right, stay close." Together, we moved toward the sound, my flashlight leading the way. Each step deeper into the woods made me feel increasingly vulnerable, but I couldn't let fear stop me, not now. Branches clawed at us, roots tried to trip us up, but we kept going. Suddenly, we broke into a small clearing. At the far side stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered, door hanging loosely from rusted hinges. I aimed my flashlight toward the building, revealing streaks of dark liquid on the wooden walls, stark against the weathered surface. "Blood," the man whispered, voice shaking with dread. "Oh my God." "Stay here," I ordered, stepping forward carefully. "I'll check it out." With every nerve in my body screaming for me to turn back, I moved cautiously toward the cabin. Each step felt heavy, deliberate. The cabin loomed in front of me, sinister and silent. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking ominously. My flashlight illuminated the small interior. Furniture lay scattered and broken across the floor, and in the center, something gleamed brightly, a gold necklace, the chain snapped in two. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard the soft whispering laughter again, high-pitched, mocking, coming closer. I spun around, flashlight raised, my pulse roaring in my ears. There was no one there. Panic surged within me as I realized the man was gone, vanished without a trace, as if the darkness had swallowed him whole. I was alone once more, standing in the shadows of that haunted place, listening as the laughter echoed and faded into the distance. My breathing became shallow and rapid, my pulse racing. I stepped outside the cabin once more, flashlight trembling in my grip. The clearing was empty again, save for the oppressive feeling of unseen eyes watching from the darkness. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, as though holding its breath in anticipation. "Hello?" I called again, my voice barely more than a whisper. There was no answer, only the distant rustling of leaves carried by a light wind. Steeling my nerves, I decided to retrace my steps to the campground. I started moving back, faster this time, breaking into a steady jog, desperate to escape the heavy sense of dread closing around me. Emerging from the tree line, relief flooded me as I saw the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the campground. Several patrol cars and an ambulance had pulled up, deputies combing through the campsite with flashlights. I quickened my pace, reaching them breathless and shaken. "Deputy," one of the officers called, hurrying over. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said, forcing composure into my voice. "There is a cabin deep in the woods. We need to search it immediately. We have multiple missing people." A search party was quickly organized, equipped with radios and heavy-duty flashlights. I guided the team back through the trees toward the cabin, though my sense of direction felt oddly distorted, the woods unfamiliar and twisted. It took longer than it should have, but eventually we found our way back. The cabin stood silently, bathed in pale moonlight. I motioned silently for the team to move in cautiously. As we approached, a deputy beside me whispered, "Do you hear that?" I paused, straining to listen. At first, nothing. Then a low, rhythmic chanting drifted through the night, growing clearer with each passing moment. It was coming from behind the cabin. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs as we carefully moved toward the source. Rounding the corner, we froze in collective shock. In a wide circle stood figures cloaked in dark robes, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. In the circle's center lay several bound and gagged campers, terror-stricken eyes pleading silently. The robed figures continued their chant, rhythmic and hypnotic as though oblivious to our presence. "Police, put your hands up," I shouted, aiming my flashlight and weapon at the nearest figure. The chanting ceased abruptly, plunging us into a deafening silence. Slowly, one by one, they turned toward us, faces obscured but clearly focused. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if on some unseen signal, the robed figures scattered in all directions, blending seamlessly into the shadows. Chaos erupted as officers shouted orders, chasing after fleeing suspects, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. I hurried to the campers, quickly freeing them from their restraints. Their relief was palpable, but the terror in their eyes lingered. "What happened here?" I asked, urgently helping a shaken woman to her feet. "They said they needed us," she whispered hoarsely. "Needed our fear, our screams. They were feeding off of it." The woods around us filled with calls from deputies pursuing fleeing suspects, but the search yielded nothing. Not one of the cloaked figures was found, leaving us only with unanswered questions and an unsettling mystery. As dawn broke, casting pale light across the campground, the nightmare seemed surreal, yet hauntingly real. Each camper was accounted for, but the cloaked figures, the shadows, had vanished completely, as if they'd never existed. Days passed into weeks, the investigation revealing nothing substantial. Whispering Pines campground was permanently closed, left abandoned, and reclaimed by the wilderness. But I can never forget the laughter in the dark or the haunting chant echoing still in my mind. Each quiet night shift reminds me that the woods hold secrets, dark truths hidden beneath layers of shadow, waiting patiently for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too close. You made it to the end. Some stories stay with you long after the lights come back on. If this one did, leave a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves the dark. More true horror drops soon. Stay alert and stay safe.